In Money Watch, the Biden administration's ban on investing in dozens of Chinese companies goes into effect today. Earlier this summer, President Biden signed an executive order expanding the ban, which was first put in place under the Trump administration. Let's bring in Amy Celico. She's a principal at the Albright Stonebridge Group and co-leads the firm's China practice. She's also previously worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So let's start off with what kinds of companies are being included on the list and why the Biden administration is targeting them.
Well, today this executive order takes effect, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of news about it because American investors still have 12 months to reduce their holdings in any investments. But to answer your question, the companies that have been targeted by the Biden administration are any Chinese companies with links to the Chinese military or Chinese surveillance companies. And so there was a list of 59 companies that were put on the executive order. And so American investors will be prohibited from investing in them. And again, the intent of this executive order is to not support China's military modernization, to not support China's surveillance industry, which of course is tied to serious allegations of human rights abuses in China. The Biden executive order, in fact, cleans up an executive order that was made during the Trump administration. It was very unclear for American investors exactly who was covered and how they would be impacted. And so this Biden administration executive order, issued in June, coming into effect today, makes it very clear that the Department of the Treasury is going to oversee a list of Chinese companies with whom American investors should not be engaged.
So that's on the company side. What about the U.S. investors? What type of investors are we talking about? I saw on the list, Huawei's on the list. I know that, they got sort of cheap equipment that some small towns have invested in when they needed to expand some of their Wi-Fi stuff. So I don't know if, your local town may be impacted. So tell me about the investors. And then, what does this mean for them? Do they have to sort of pull their money out of these companies?
That's exactly right. It's for any investor that is involved with any of the major Chinese telecommunications companies. Huawei, for example, Hikvision, a major surveillance company. And so the Department of the Treasury has listed the Chinese companies involved. And so there can be no American involvement in funds that include those companies or in those companies' investments themselves. You have 12 months now to withdraw any investments so that you are not, and you being any American investor, engaged in supporting those companies. And the president has been very clear in saying if there are additional Chinese companies with links to the Chinese military or the surveillance industry, this list can be expanded. The Treasury Department is responsible for issuing this list and expanding it in the future.
So then, what impact has this move had on the Biden administration, or move by the Biden administration, rather, had on U.S.-China relations? How is China reacting?
Well, over the past 2 months, since this executive order was published on June 3rd, the relationship has continued to deteriorate. And in fact, what is in the news this week, I think I would foresee, is going to be China's continued crackdown on its own private companies, both their listings and their behavior within China, as well as any IPOs they attempt outside of China. So the Chinese government has very significantly cracked down on its internet platform companies, on e-commerce companies, and most recently on private education companies. And this is going to impact American investors as well, because the Chinese government is saying we want to be able to approve any Chinese company before it lists, for example, in the United States. And so, Anne-Marie, this expands the concerns that international investors have in Chinese companies much more broadly than the U.S. administration move. The Chinese government, too, is impacting how and whether international investors can invest in Chinese companies for very different reasons. But the Chinese government is saying we're concerned about the data security of our Chinese companies. And if they list in the United States, of course, they need to release information to our SEC. And that may pose national security considerations in the Chinese government's opinion. So what we're seeing here really is the Biden administration taking moves because of national security considerations to limit American investors in some Chinese companies. And then the Chinese government also taking action to limit the ability of its companies from listing in international exchanges. This really looks to me like a continued decoupling of the US and China in the financial sector, which is one area where, of course, our two economies have been incredibly interdependent over the past decade.
Amy Celico, thank you.